95% of potash used in the US annually is imported, and over 90% of that comes from Canada. Maybe it's a shot in the arm for Canada to get a little bit more independent. This pink mineral, which might seem like ordinary inexpensive grains of powder, can shake the White House. Following the US tariffs, Canada is considering cutting potash exports to the US as much as possible. And if you think this decision is insignificant, just look at the price of fertilizer. In key agricultural states, fertilizer prices jumped 38% in just 3 days. The harvest could fail, and the silence from Ottawa is making Washington more worried than ever. Even many American farmers are having to abandon fields they've been attached to their entire lives. Could a pink mineral found kilometers beneath the Earth's surface become a new strategic weapon in the North American trade war? Is this revenge? Or is it a subtle warning about a world where trust is gradually being replaced by dependence? A small note is that the video is independently analytical based on public information, and does not represent any individuals, organizations, or political trends. We encourage you to explore, broaden your perspectives, and comment. Let's get started. Amidst the tranquil fields of Saskatchewan, where the land seems to hold nothing but snow and time and mineral, is quietly shaping the destiny of an entire agricultural industry. They call it potash, a rather unimpressive name. But behind that layer of pale pink dust lies an entire power structure. A staggering fact that few people know is that over 50% of the world's potash production comes from just 3 countries, with Canada accounting for a staggering 38%, most of which lies kilometers deep beneath the Saskatchewan River. What about the US? Last year they produced less than 400,000 tons, but it consumes up to 5 million tons, a gap that cannot be filled by slogans or tariffs. While the US seemed to control the world's oil, Canada, with its mineral wealth deep underground, held what truly made the crops flourish. Without oil, the car won't run. Without potash, plants cannot survive. But what makes potash special isn't just its yield. It's its irreplaceable nature. Unlike oil, which can be purchased from the Middle East, Venezuela, or the North Sea, potash is a difficult resource to redirect. According to the Narwhal, 2 other major exporters are currently cut off from many Western markets. And that's what makes Canada an irreplaceable supplier. A question that many people are interested in. If a country holds the key to the global agricultural supply chain, but has never declared itself a superpower, is that a strength? Are weaknesses being awakened? And then the impact was no longer confined to forecast reports. It had spread into reality. Global fertilizer prices have fluctuated sharply since news broke that Canada was reconsidering its potash exports to the US. In states like Iowa, the retail price of potash fertilizer has increased by as much as 25 or 30% in just 2 weeks. According to reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, at agricultural supply stores, people are starting to see stocks dwindle, not because of a shortage of goods, but because they are afraid to sell at the old prices. And so potash, once a foreign name, gradually became something that made the entire American countryside uneasy. In fact, many American farmers even had to speak out to call for potassium to be exempt from the general tax, due to concerns about the agricultural industry. Although Canada hasn't made an official announcement yet, the temporary suspension of export assessments was enough to shake the market. The US is accustomed to using oil for bargaining and gas for threats. Canada lets the land speak for itself. And for the first time, it was realized that what Canada could control was the livelihoods of the American farmers themselves. From Saskatchewan to a supermarket in Chicago, from an empty potash mine to the dinner table of every American family, this supply chain is more fragile than we think. And when it's shaken, no one knows who will feel the first shock, the farmers or the politicians themselves. Does Washington underestimate a country just because they speak quietly? And when the land begins to speak, who will truly hold the levers of the 21st century? When the US imposed a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, many expected a tit-for-tat response, an angry tweet, a retaliatory strike with aluminum cars or frozen beef. But no, Canada didn't get angry. They acted quietly, but enough to make the United States wary. In British Columbia, where snow-capped mountains cast their shadow over the Pacific Ocean, the first LNG train of the LNG Canada project has just departed for Japan. a milestone in Canadian trade history. This is the first time Canadian liquefied natural gas has gone directly to Asia without transiting through the United States. While Washington threatened with tweets, Vancouver sent a stream of gas. Historically, 97% of Canadian oil and gas flows south to American refineries. Energy infrastructure is almost entirely dependent on pipelines leading down to Texas or other U.S. industrial states. But now things are changing. The Trans Mountain Pipeline connecting Alberta to the Pacific coast is being fast-tracked. The $40 billion LNG Canada port in Kitimat has begun operations at a capacity of 14 million tons per year, which could double in a later phase. Canada is also promoting the East-West Pipeline, a natural gas pipeline connecting to the Atlantic Ocean. If previously Canada was a small stream merging into the American economic flow, now it is recarving its own path to the ocean. But why is this important? Because while the U.S. is busy confronting, Canada is creating options. Gas tankers from British Columbia take only half the time to reach Japan compared to those departing from the Gulf of Mexico, meaning shipping costs are lower, delivery time is faster, long-term contracts are more stable. And in the Asian context, especially in Japan, South Korea, and China, which are rapidly replacing coal with cleaner natural gas, Canada is becoming a new strategic partner. They don't need to shout, "Make Canada great again." They just need to open the ports. Many people say this is a sophisticated act of revenge. But according to the Canadian government, this is not retaliation, but long-term restructuring. In a July statement, the Canadian Prime Minister called it sovereignty through infrastructure. If verbal sparring can heat up the media, infrastructure is what can cool things down. And perhaps that's something Washington never anticipated. We are both energy-producing countries. But as Canada looked east towards Asia, the U.S. remained focused domestically, seeking to control market share within the North American market itself. Alaska LNG, a U.S. project to export liquefied natural gas, is still delayed due to a lack of pipelines. Meanwhile, Canada was able to get gas to sea before the U.S. even completed the permitting process. The question is, in this race, who is currently in the lead, and who's busy threatening while the competition quietly delivers? It's worth noting that Canada isn't just doing this with gas, and they did the same with potash, with oil, with steel, all of which formed a synchronized strategy. Potash export cuts create fertilizer shortage effect in the U.S. Oil diverting the flow from south to east and west. Steel domestic investment, mandatory Canadian steel in government projects. The counterattack didn't come from weapons, but from concrete pipelines and newly opened seaports. Is this a Canadian-style response model with few words and many actions? And if that's true, why is it getting the attention of the White House? While Canada was busy turning towards the Pacific, the price wave began to spread south. From the mines of Saskatchewan to the arid fields of Kansas, a lack of potash, cheap gas, and infrastructure stability is leaving American farmers feeling left behind. In the north, Canada quietly turned the valve. In the south, the land is starting to cry out for water. The wind blew across the cornfields of Iowa, carrying not the scent of life, but the smell of waiting. On the cracked earth, the farmers silently looked at the empty fertilizer bags. A third-generation farmer in Des Moines responding in a local news report, "We need potassium in the next 2 weeks. If we don't have, we'll lose our harvest." According to a report by Morningstar, since Canada announced its review of potash exports, the price of potash fertilizer in some inland U.S. states has surged by 32% in just 12 days. The retail price of DAP increased from $785 ton to $120 ton. The market share of potash imported from Canada accounts for 84% of the potassium used in the United States. When a country stops supplying, an entire agricultural system feels unstable. Does trade policy take into account agricultural seasonality? And could a political battle from Washington cause farmers in Nebraska to lose their crops? Corey Rosenbusch, president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute in Denver, Colorado, said those countries would not fill the gap if the U.S. agricultural sector shifted away from Canadian potash. Speaking to Global News, he said there will not be enough global supply to completely replace that amount of potassium. Even with tariffs, we still need Canadian potash, a nutrient. One of the largest potash producers in Saskatchewan has warned that the final tariff costs will ultimately fall on the shoulders of American farmers. While Canada was busy turning towards the Pacific, the price wave began to spread south. From the mines of Saskatchewan to the arid fields of Kansas, a lack of potash, cheap gas, and infrastructure stability is leaving American farmers feeling left behind. In the north, Canada quietly turned the valve. In the south, the land is starting to cry out for water. The wind blew across the cornfields of Iowa, carrying not the scent of life, but the smell of waiting. On the cracked earth, the farmers silently looked at the empty fertilizer bags. A third-generation farmer in Des Moines responding in a local news report, "We need potassium in the next 2 weeks. If we don't have, we'll lose our harvest." According to a report by Morningstar, since Canada announced its review of potash exports, the price of potash fertilizer in some inland U.S. states has surged by 32% in just 12 days. The retail price of DAP increased from $785 ton to $120 ton. The market share of potash imported from Canada accounts for 84% of the potassium used in the United States. When a country stops supplying, an entire agricultural system feels unstable. Does trade policy take into account agricultural seasonality? And could a political battle from Washington cause farmers in Nebraska to lose their crops? Corey Rosenbush, president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute in Denver, Colorado, said those countries would not fill the gap if the U.S. agricultural sector shifted away from Canadian potash. Speaking to Global News, he said there will not be enough global supply to completely replace that amount of potassium. Even with tariffs, we still need Canadian potash, a nutrient. One of the largest potash producers in Saskatchewan has warned that the final tariff costs will ultimately fall on the shoulders of American farmers. The company told Global News that they have been and are collaborating with policymakers and stakeholders in the United States and Canada to oppose the tariffs. According to Morningstar and the National Post, the U.S. tariffs on Canadian fertilizer are actually being paid by American consumers and farmers themselves. Canada did not suffer significant losses. Potash-producing companies like Nutrien are keeping selling prices stable. The ultimate burden falls on the final buyer, the farmer. Political leverage has created an economic spiral, and the victims are those who wield hoes, not ballots. It's no coincidence that the states most heavily affected are Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and Kansas. All deep red states that voted for the White House in 2020. A farmer spoke before the town hall in Missouri saying, "We don't need any more slogans. We need potassium." Data from the USDA shows that over 64% of cultivated land in the Midwest relies on fertilizers sourced from Canada. Rising fuel and fertilizer prices have led to negative profit margins for over a third of smallholder farmers. Washington is trying to gain leverage at the negotiating table. While American farmers are struggling with every liter of water and every kilogram of fertilizer, and each new tweet about commercial success makes corn farmers recheck their bank loan books. While American farmers await potash from the North Canadian farmers, particularly in Saskatchewan, are protected by domestic production support policies and stable subsidies. Both held plows, but one side was protected while the other was encouraged to endure for the country. According to an analysis by the Narwhal, Canadians, despite living in a resource-exporting country, receive more support within the domestic value chain. While in the U.S., agricultural states are often sidelined in macroeconomic trade strategies. If there is a lack of potash, crop yields decrease, productivity is down, supply is down, agricultural prices are rising, and food prices are also increasing. In Chicago, the wholesale price of wheat increased by 6% in the last week. Corn prices increased by 8%. And according to market analysts, if the potash shortage lasts another 3 months, the prices of meat, dairy, and vegetables could increase by 12 to 18% by the end of autumn. A single piece of feces that doesn't fall to the ground could cost a family in Ohio an extra $0.00 per month in grocery bills. When the soil is dry, the plants don't grow. When policies are disconnected, the people's hearts are hard to keep. Canada doesn't need to be loud. They just need to temporarily suspend shipments. And sometimes the absence of a potash train is more shocking than any White House press conference. Who is suffering more, the tax partner or the domestic population? And in this game, who is the one who is truly left behind? In modern geopolitics, there is much talk about energy, technology, or even data. But few people pay attention to something equally important: dependency. When a country controls a supply you can't replace, they don't need to issue an ultimatum. They just need to be quiet. And this time, Canada is the country that chose silence. Canada supplies up to 84% of the potash imported by the United States. The U.S. has virtually no domestic alternatives. In 2023, it produced less than 400,000 tons while consuming over 5 million. The remaining supplies are being blocked by barriers and instability. It's like finding out that the only mechanic in your house who knows how to fix the machine is on vacation, and you don't have anyone else's number. That it's hard to believe that a country with a defense budget of over $800 billion, a global military network, and the power to print money is being held back by a pink mineral from the Canadian earth. It turns out that power isn't always in the hands of the loudest people. Sometimes it lies at the feet of those who know how to wait for the right moment to say nothing. If dependence is a weakness, then why maintain it for decades? And if Canada suspends potash today, gas tomorrow, and steel the day after, how will the United States react? Canada is like a large utility pole. We usually don't pay any attention to it, but just a few hours of power outage, the whole city is shaken, or like a small door hinge. No one mentions it until the door won't open. Potash is not a diamond, but without it, farmers can't grow crops. When they can't grow it, the supermarket chain has no stock. And then everything started to change. While the U.S. launched sanctions and threats, Canada chose a strategy of infrastructure investment, pipeline construction, and trade diversification. While the U.S. uses a carrot and stick approach, Canada exerts pressure through supply chains and calculations of policy stability. Canada doesn't need to win in a confrontation. They just need to clarify a reality. If the U.S. chooses to weaponize trade, then Canada can completely turn what used to be normal into leverage. And in a world full of instability, is today's dependence tomorrow's crisis waiting to happen? From Mexico City to Berlin, from Canberra to Seoul, small and medium-sized economies are watching Canada as a model of quiet but profound response. Mexico is strengthening its relationships with the EU and Asia to reduce its export dependence on the U.S., which previously accounted for over 80%. Germany is now investing billions of euros in LNG from Qatar and Norway. Australia is shifting its mineral exports to India and Southeast Asia, a harmony that doesn't require agreement, but shares the same strategy, reducing risk from political dependence on a single market. While the U.S. imposed tariffs, Canada did not choose to negotiate immediately. They chose the infrastructure. They opened the pipeline. They built a port. They are restructuring the steel industry. They temporarily suspended potash exports, not in writing, but by an indefinite waiting period. One side is causing a commotion. One side changes the foundation. When the world talks about globalization, they talk about speed, efficiency, and optimizing supply chains. But 2020 has raised the question again. 2024, with the US-Canada trade conflict, is offering a reminder. Globalization is not something everyone has control over, and one day the supply chain could be tightened, just because of a decision made across the ocean. Canada is doing what many countries are thinking about, but haven't dared to do. Self-reliance is not a barrier to growth. It's a long-term insurance investment. From 2022 to 2024, investment in Canada's independent export infrastructure increased by over 64%, primarily in energy, minerals, and logistics. Meanwhile, 97% of Canada's oil and gas used to go to the U.S. Now there's a roadmap to reduce that to below 80% in the next 5 years. Potash exports to the U.S. valued at nearly $5 billion Canadian dollars annually are being reconsidered as leverage rather than destiny. A dependent economy is like a fast sports car, but the gas comes from someone else's gas station. Canada is learning how to build its own gas stations, and that makes the car a little slower, but more durable. Be more proactive, less likely to lose money. If even a neighboring country like Canada has to prepare for escaping the shadow of the United States, how many other countries are thinking the same way but haven't dared to say it out loud? For over a century, America has been the center of global trade. It's not just because they're strong, but because they're stable. It's not just because they're rich, but because they're trustworthy. But in recent years, that belief seems to be eroding, not only in the eyes of adversaries, but even in the eyes of allies. Canada is beginning to shift its trade towards Asia. Mexico is tightening cooperation with the European Union. Japan, South Korea, India have successfully signed bilateral trade agreements with each other, bypassing Washington. When those who once stood by you start preparing a plan B, it's probably not because they betrayed you, but because you're no longer as trustworthy as you used to be. Relying on foreign supply is not a new phenomenon, but depending on its own rigidity, that's what's concerning. When imposing tariffs to exert pressure, the U.S. is once again putting consumers and farmers in a difficult position. This is not advice. This is a suggestion from a broader perspective where power is no longer about who shouts the loudest, but about who is chosen for longer-term collaboration. The U.S. should consider reinvesting in the domestic supply chain, but not for self-isolation. Substantive dialogue, not just a deal. Not every country views trade as a negotiation. Canada doesn't negotiate by tweet. They use the infrastructure to keep friends. Perhaps it's time for the U.S. to listen more and make more sustainable decisions. Invest in education and sustainable agriculture. A strong country cannot forever rely on abandoned farmers. As technology changes and the land becomes barren due to climate change, farmers need to be retrained, supported, and re-equipped with more than just a one-time check. For over a century, America has been the center of global trade. It's not just because they're strong, but because they're stable. It's not just because they're rich, but because they're trustworthy. But in recent years, that belief seems to be eroding, not only in the eyes of adversaries, but even in the eyes of allies. Canada is beginning to shift its trade towards Asia. Mexico is tightening cooperation with the European Union. Japan, South Korea, India have successfully signed bilateral trade agreements with each other, bypassing Washington. When those who once stood by you start preparing a plan B, it's probably not because